Settle in with a cup of tea and your imagination. This is Detective Duo, where every clue finds its place, just as Tommy and Tuppence would have insisted. Don't forget to subscribe and tell us where in the world you're joining from. The clock on the mantel had just struck 11 when the pass slipped neatly out of a book. Tuppence Beresford, surrounded by a cheerful chaos of wartime keepsakes, was kneeling on the drawing-room carpet of South Audley Mansions. Old ration cards, service medals, faded postcards from Cairo, souvenirs of a life spent in excitement now being tamed into order for a charity sale. Tommy, perched on the sofa with the tolerant air of a man who has long ago surrendered to his wife's enthusiasms, was attempting to wind string round a box that refused to cooperate. "Tommy, honestly, if you knot it like that, no one will ever be able to open it again," she said, brushing dust from her skirt. "That," he replied, "is the best preventive against curiosity I know." She gave him a look halfway between affection and exasperation. "Curiosity, my dear husband, is the only thing that keeps life from going stale. What's this?" From the hollow spine of a worn volume of Field Operations, 1943 had slipped a yellowed envelope. The paper was brittle, the writing on it, precise, faint, military, read Major Beresford, confidential. Tommy frowned. "That's my name, but I don't recall ever receiving top-secret mail in a gardening book." Tuppence's eyes shone. Perhaps someone hid it there on purpose. "Oh, do open it." "Darling, you've read too many thrillers, and you've lived too few lately. Go on." Tommy sighed, the sigh of a man doomed to be interesting against his will, and slit the flap. Inside was a single sheet bearing a brief, coded message of letters and numbers, and at the bottom a cryptic signature, R.K. The handwriting trembled slightly, as though written in haste or fear. Tuppence examined it closely, tilting it toward the lamplight. "R.K., she murmured. "Ring any bells?" "None at all. Could be anyone from a regimental clerk to Rudolph the Kipper, for all I know." "Don't be obtuse. It says, 'Final exchange delayed. Meet arranged for Wednesday. Confirmation impossible. R.K.' That sounds like espionage to me." Tommy raised an eyebrow. "Or like two chaps trying to trade surplus boots. You do have a flair for melodrama, old thing." But Tuppence was already in motion, hunting through the rest of the book. "There's nothing else here. No date, no address. Only this." She looked up, excitement warming her cheeks. "Tommy, suppose it's connected with that old double-agent business. You remember the rumours after the war?" Tommy, who remembered more than he cared to, said quietly, "Those were dangerous days, Tuppence, best left to sleep." She smiled, undeterred. "Oh, but you know I've never been able to let sleeping mysteries lie." He folded the paper again, slipped it back into the envelope, and placed it on the mantel as if restoring it to neutrality. "Then let's hope this one snores quietly." Evening drifted in over the city, bringing the faint hum of traffic and the comfort of lamps switching on across the square. Fritz, their long-suffering housekeeper, had gone home hours earlier, leaving the couple alone with Coco and mild contentment. Or rather, contentment for Tommy. Tuppence was still staring at the envelope as though willing it to reveal more. When the doorbell rang at 8:30, she jumped. "Visitors at this hour? Perhaps your mysterious correspondent?" Tommy rose, muttering, "If it's anyone selling encyclopedias, I'm joining the Foreign Office again." The man who entered was tall, silver-haired, and carried the air of someone accustomed to giving orders without raising his voice. Sir Andrew Linton, retired from His Majesty's intelligence, was both an old friend and a living reminder that the past never stays filed away. "Tommy, my dear fellow," he said warmly, shaking hands, "and Mrs. Beresford, still keeping him properly inspected?" "Regularly and without mercy," said Tuppence. "Do sit down, Sir Andrew. You look as though you've come straight from a committee." He smiled faintly. "From something rather more delicate. I shan't keep you long." His gaze settled on the envelope on the mantel. "That, by any chance, isn't addressed to Major Beresford, is it?" Tommy stiffened. "You've a sharp eye." "It's a professional habit. I thought I recognized the handwriting." He paused, and the genial tone drained from his face. "Where did you get it?" Tuppence explained, briskly but truthfully. Linton listened without interruption, fingers tapping his cane. When she finished, he said quietly, "R.K., you don't know who that was?" Tommy shook his head. Apparently not, though I gather you do. Linton hesitated. We all knew him once, codename Raven Keeper, a man who played both sides during the war and vanished before the armistice, officially dead, unofficially. He glanced toward the window as if the darkness might be listening. Unofficially, there were always doubts. Tuppence leaned forward. Doubts. That he died, or that he was ever on our side? Both, said Linton. He handled sensitive exchanges in occupied Europe. The last report from him spoke of a final exchange that never occurred. Tommy's voice was flat. That's the phrase in this note, Linton nodded, which is why I'm here. Someone using Ravenkeeper's name has been seen, alive, in Devon. The silence that followed had weight. The clock ticked once, self-consciously. Tommy found his voice. Seen by whom? One of our informants. Reliable. He swears the man is older, altered, but the same. It may be nonsense, but if it isn't, it touches on matters that should have stayed buried. I thought you ought to know. Tuppence's eyes gleamed. You mean to say a dead double agent has returned to life? Tommy, we can't possibly ignore that. Her husband groaned. We certainly can, and will. But Linton shook his head. I'm afraid it's not so simple. If Ravenkeeper truly survived, someone has been maintaining his silence for 20 years. That means blackmail, hidden records, any number of unpleasant possibilities. You, Major, were among the few who had contact with his file. I was a messenger boy in comparison, Tommy protested. All the same, he trusted you. He left a note addressed to you, and now this turns up. Coincidence seems thin. Tuppence smiled triumphantly. There you are, Tommy. Even the intelligence service agrees it's destiny. Linton rose, setting his cane to the floor with deliberate care. Destiny or danger, Mrs. Beresford, I advise caution. If you pursue this, be discreet. There are those who would prefer the past to remain dead. She met his gaze steadily. We've danced with danger before, Sir Andrew. He gave a small bow. Then dance wisely. When he had gone, the door closing softly behind him, Tommy exhaled. Well, that's that. We're not getting involved. Tuppence had already retrieved the envelope from the mantel. On the contrary, we're already involved. I mean to find out why R.K. wrote to you, what he meant by final exchange, and who saw him in Devon. Tommy sank into the armchair, resigned. You know, I sometimes think marriage was the most dangerous operation of my career. She laughed, tucking the envelope into her handbag. You married excitement, dear boy, and you've had value for money. Later that night, after she'd gone to bed, Tommy sat by the dying fire with a glass of whiskey and the coded sheet spread before him. The neat lines of numbers and letters might have meant anything, or nothing, yet somewhere in his memory a faint echo stirred, the rhythm of an old cipher they had once used to send innocuous messages through occupied territory. He reached for a pencil and began sketching possibilities. Final exchange, delayed, Wednesday, a rendezvous never kept, a man who vanished twice, once into war and once into legend. From the bedroom, Tuppence's voice floated out sleepily. Tommy, do turn out the light. You'll need all your wits in the morning. He smiled faintly. I rather think I shall. Outside, the city murmured, indifferent to secrets. The small flame of the lamp threw shadows on the walls, shadows shaped like letters, or perhaps like ghosts. And in the quiet flat at South Audley Mansions, the adventure of the legacy of the double agent had already begun. You realize, said Tuppence as she snapped her handbag shut with the crisp finality of a woman embarking on a crusade, that we are, at this very moment, engaged in espionage. Tommy glanced up from the newspaper he was pretending to read as they sat in the waiting room of the War Office archives. I should say we're engaged in waiting, which is far less romantic and far more British. Oh, nonsense, she retorted. You've forgotten the thrill of secrecy. Look at all this. Her gloved hand made an admiring gesture toward the room. Long rows of filing cabinets, green-shaded lamps, and clerks who moved with the unhurried solemnity of people who guarded ghosts. The air smelled faintly of dust and government ink. Tommy murmured, It smells like the inside of a filing cabinet, which, come to think of it, is precisely where old secrets go to die. but his eyes sharpened as the attendant returned with a folder marked Intelligence Service, Confidential, 1944. It was stamped declassified for review. He signed the register, and the two of them took the folder to a small side table under a buzzing light. Tuppence opened it with reverence. Inside were a few brittle pages, interrogation reports, telegram fragments, and a partially burned photograph. On the top sheet, a name, Raven Keeper, R.K. Below it, status, missing, presumed dead, allegiance, unverified. Tuppence's pulse quickened. So he was real. Plenty of ghosts in those files are real, said Tommy, scanning the page. The trick is finding which ones still haunt the living. They read in silence for several minutes. A report by Major Lennox described the events of March 1944, a failed rendezvous near Bruges, the disappearance of R.K., and rumours that he had betrayed the operation to the Germans. But then came something odd. A witness statement unsigned in a different hand. He had no choice. The betrayal was ordered. Tuppence looked up sharply. Ordered by whom? That changes everything. Tommy leaned back, tapping the paper. Or it means someone's trying to tidy up a messy story. You know what officialdom's like. When in doubt, redact. She studied him, half exasperated, half amused. Tommy, you are criminally unromantic. I'm alive, which is better. I like my romance in peacetime proportions, with scones, not spies. But he smiled, because he could see the old spark in her eyes, the spark that had once carried them through gunfire and false passports. Tuppence turned another page. Look, this part's been blacked out. She traced the thick ink, whole lines of it. Someone didn't want even the ghosts to talk. Perhaps they were shy. Perhaps, she said, there was more to Raven Keeper than betrayal. She copied down the remaining names on a scrap of paper. Linton, Venn, Mallory, each associated with brief notes. Finance, operations, clearance. 3 links in a chain, and one of them their friend Sir Andrew Linton. Tommy frowned. Linton again. You think he told us everything last night? Tuppence hesitated. I think he told us everything he believed was safe to say, which is quite a different thing. They left the building into a grey London afternoon. Not fog, but a thick wash of light that turned everything the colour of old postcards. Pigeons strutted before the War Office gates. A taxi splashed through a puddle and hissed away. Tuppence tucked her notebook into her handbag and glanced around. Don't look now, Tommy, but I think we've acquired an admirer. He didn't turn his head, merely adjusted his hat. Where? Across the street. Bowler hat, umbrella, pretending to read the Times. Hasn't turned a page in 10 minutes. Tommy's voice was dry. Could be an exceptionally dull article. Or an exceptionally interested man. They strolled on, arm in arm, as though merely enjoying the afternoon. The man followed at a polite distance and far enough not to alarm, close enough to suggest purpose. When they paused to look in a shop window, he paused too. Tommy, whispered Tuppence, should we confront him? Certainly not. Nothing spoils a pursuit like mutual recognition. Let's give him something to follow. They ducked into a tea shop on Whitehall. When the doorbell tinkled behind them, Tommy caught the faint reflection of the man entering, pretending to study the pastry case. He ordered tea and 2 currant buns, spoke idly of cricket, and kept one eye on the window. 10 minutes later, the man stepped outside and disappeared into the traffic. Tuppence sighed. Gone, which means he'll be back. Probably, said Tommy. Still, it's nice to be of interest again. I was beginning to feel middle-aged. You are middle-aged, she said sweetly, but at least you're interesting. That evening, South Audley Mansions felt unusually quiet. The ticking clock seemed louder, the lampglow softer, almost conspiratorial. Tuppence, unable to rest, spread her notes across the dining table. Tommy tried reading, failed, and instead watched her with the fond exasperation of a man who had long ago given up pretending to control her. You know, he said, if you keep poking at that file, something unpleasant will poke back. She didn't look up. Then we'll poke harder. He smiled faintly. You make espionage sound like crochet. Tuppence traced the words. He had no choice with her fingertip. That's what I can't stop thinking. Whoever wrote that wanted someone to know the truth, but only if they looked for it. And we are apparently the designated fools. Exactly. She gathered the papers, ready to lock them away, when the sound came, soft, almost polite, a faint rustle from the corridor outside their flat. Tommy rose, crossing silently to the door. He opened it quickly, catching only the echo of footsteps retreating down the stairwell. On the floor lay a single envelope. No stamp, no handwriting, just plain cream paper. He carried it inside, laid it on the table between them. Tuppence stared. Not again. Tommy tore it open. Inside, a single sheet of paper, typed on an old machine. Leave the past buried, or it will bury you. For a moment, neither spoke. The faint hum of the city outside filled the silence. Then Tuppence said, "Well, that's not at all ominous." Tommy held the note to the light. Cheap paper, type uneven. Probably done on an old Remington. No signature, of course. Our admirer, perhaps? She smiled, but the edge of excitement trembled with unease. If it is, he's frightfully well-mannered. I'd almost prefer a more direct threat. "Don't worry," said Tommy. "There's time for that yet." She looked up sharply. "You're not suggesting we stop?" "On the contrary," he said. "If someone's so desperate to keep us out, there must be something worth finding." Her eyes met his, full of the shared thrill of old adventures, the same spark that had drawn them into danger before. Then it settled. He sighed, half smiling. "I knew that tone. It means I've lost before we've begun." "Of course you have. It's what makes our marriage so efficient." She tucked the anonymous letter beside the coded note from RK. "The dead man's voice, the living man's warning," she murmured. "I rather like the symmetry." Tommy poured 2 small whiskies, handed her one. "To symmetry," he said dryly, "and to the hope we don't end up part of it." They clinked glasses. Outside, a car passed slowly down the street, its headlights sweeping the curtains like a searchlight. The sound lingered, then faded. Tuppence set her glass down and smiled, almost mischievously. "You know, Tommy, when I was sorting those boxes yesterday, I wished for a bit of excitement. And here it is, knocking on our door." "Next time," he said, "wish for a holiday in Switzerland. Much safer." She laughed softly, but the mirth didn't quite reach her eyes. The letters on the table seemed to pulse faintly in the lamplight, the living message and the dead one side by side. And somewhere beyond the closed curtains, the watcher, or another like him, was surely still out there, patient as a shadow. "Seaside air," said Tuppence Beresford with deep satisfaction, stepping down from the train, "has a way of making even secrets smell fresher." Tommy followed, carrying their modest luggage and trying not to trip over a porter's trolley. "Or fishier," he observed. "I can't yet decide which applies to us." The little station at Kingsport-on-Sea looked as though it had retired from life sometime around the armistice, and was content to remain so. A single clock ticked lazily above the platform. Beyond the iron gates the town unfolded in soft, sun-washed disorder, narrow lanes sloping toward the harbour, boats tilted on their sides like sleeping seals, gulls calling with a sound that might have been laughter or warning. They took rooms at the Anchor's Rest, a small inn that smelled faintly of salt, polish, and the ghosts of long-ago sailors. The innkeeper, Mrs. Mallory, greeted them with the brisk warmth of one accustomed to strangers who never stayed long. "Room 3, overlooking the water," she said. "It's not fancy, mind you, but the tide sounds pleasant enough when you can't sleep." "Perfect," said Tuppence. "We find the sea soothing, don't we, Tommy?" Tommy made a non-committal sound. "Provided it doesn't talk back." Mrs. Mallory laughed. She was a sturdy woman in her late 50s, with quick blue eyes and hands that moved as if perpetually drying themselves on an invisible apron. "Not much trouble in Kingsport these days," she said as she led them upstairs. "Just the usual gossip. Tourists, fishermen, and old men telling taller tales than the cliffs." Tuppence smiled. "Our favourite combination." The room was simple. Whitewashed walls, a quilt that had seen better years, and a small window framing the harbour like a painting. From it came the murmur of waves and the clink of masts knocking against one another, rhythmic as thought. After unpacking, Tuppence drifted downstairs to the lounge, where framed photographs lined the wall. Many showed the harbour in its glory days, sailors in uniform, children holding nets, ships long since broken for scrap. But one photograph caught her attention. A young man in a naval coat stood beside a woman in a summer dress. The woman's hand rested lightly on his arm, her smile both shy and knowing. Around her neck hung a distinctive silver locket, shaped like a teardrop, catching the light even in black and white. Mrs. Mallory noticed her pause. "That one's a bit old," she said. "Late 40s, I should think. Taken just after the war." "Do you remember them?" asked Tuppence casually. The woman's brow furrowed. "Him, yes. Called himself Roland Kent. Rented a room here for a few weeks. Quiet sort. Polite, but with that faraway look some soldiers get when the war's still walking behind them." Tommy, who had joined them, exchanged a glance with his wife. "Roland Kent," he repeated softly. "R.K." "Indeed," said Tuppence. "Did he leave anything behind?" Mrs. Mallory shook her head. "Nothing but the bill, and even that he paid promptly. Then one morning, gone. No farewell, no forwarding address. The young lady with him stayed on a few days, looking miserable, then she left too." "Who was she?" Tuppence asked. "I never knew. Nice manners, though, spoke like a Londoner. Wore that locket every day, said it was a gift. Funny thing, though." Mrs. Mallory's gaze drifted to the window. A few weeks later, a fisherman found something shiny caught in the rocks by the pier. Said it was the same locket, but the picture inside was gone. Tuppence's voice softened. "You still have it?" Mrs. Mallory smiled faintly. "He sold it to a jeweller in town, I heard, but I expect it's long gone now." Tommy remarked. "People don't tend to lose lockets by accident, especially when they've gone missing themselves." Mrs. Mallory gave him a curious look. "You sound like the police." "Oh, worse," said Tuppence lightly. "He's my husband." That earned them another laugh, but the woman's eyes lingered on them a little too long, as if trying to decide whether the remark was really a joke. Later that evening, Kingsport lay wrapped in a coppery glow. The tide had come in, lazy and full, brushing the pier steps with a sigh. Tuppence insisted on a walk, to feel the story under our feet, as she put it, and Tommy, as usual, submitted to the inevitable. The harbour was nearly deserted. A lone fisherman mended nets near the lamplight, humming an old tune about sailors and sirens. Across the water, the last ferry was returning from the headland, its engine a low, steady heartbeat. The smell of salt and tar filled the air. "You know," said Tuppence, "I can almost see him, Roland Kent, standing here, watching the boats, wondering whether to vanish or to stay." Tommy tucked his hands into his coat pockets. "You're giving him poetic tendencies, which is dangerous in a spy." "Everyone's poetic in hindsight," she countered, "especially the dead." They reached the end of the pier where waves struck against the stone with quiet persistence. Tuppence leaned over the railing, scanning the water below, and something caught her eye, a glimmer, faint but steady, caught between two rocks in a shallow tide pool. "Tommy, look!" Before he could protest, she was already kneeling, reaching down. Her fingers came up wet and cold, holding a small object that gleamed like a secret reborn. It was the silver locket from the photograph. The clasp was broken, the chain corroded with salt. When Tuppence opened it, the inside was empty. No picture, no inscription, just a faint oval mark where a photograph had once been pressed against the metal. She turned it in her palm, letting it catch the sunset. "So it's true," she murmured. "Mrs. Mallory's fisherman wasn't mistaken." Tommy studied it, frowning. "If that's the same locket, it's been in the sea for years. How did it end up back here?" "Perhaps the tide's in on the secret," she said softly. He smiled despite himself. "You and the tide, both incurably curious." But his gaze lingered on the dark water. The waves reflected gold from the dying sun, a beauty that carried unease beneath it. "Tuppence," he said quietly, "if Roland Kent and that woman disappeared together, who came back to drop this?" She met his eyes. "That, my dear, is exactly what we're going to find out." The wind rose slightly as they walked back toward the inn, lifting Tuppence's scarf like a banner. Lamps flickered to life one by one along the harbour, and the cries of the gulls grew shrill against the deepening sky. Somewhere behind them, a door creaked, a sound too deliberate for coincidence, and a shadow moved among the boats. Tommy stopped. "Did you hear that?" "Only the sea," said Tuppence, though her voice betrayed uncertainty. He glanced back, saw nothing but the restless shapes of nets and masts. "I've had that feeling before," he murmured, "being watched by someone who's already 2 steps ahead." They resumed walking. The inn sign swayed above them, groaning in the wind, and Mrs. Mallory's warm light glowed through the curtained windows. Yet as they reached the door, Tuppence turned once more to the harbour. The tide had risen high, swallowing the rocks where she'd found the locket. The water gleamed darkly, and for an instant she thought she saw a faint flash beneath the surface, as though something else, something metallic, had shifted below. Then it was gone. Inside, Mrs. Mallory was closing up for the night. "Out for a stroll?" she asked. "Yes," said Tuppence lightly, "and I dare say we found the sea more generous than we expected." Mrs. Mallory looked puzzled, but Tuppence offered only a smile. Upstairs, she placed the damp locket on their dressing table. It gleamed faintly in the lamplight, innocent, ordinary, and yet humming with quiet defiance of time. Tommy stood at the window, watching the last lights on the harbour fade. "I suppose we'll be visiting the local jeweller tomorrow." "Among other things," she said. "I want to know who took the picture out of that locket, and why they wanted it lost." He turned toward her, half amused, half resigned. "You do realise, Tuppence, that you never merely visit trouble, you move in with it." She laughed softly. "Well, darling, it's a seaside town. One must take lodgings somewhere." The laughter faded as she looked once more at the silver locket. There was something about its emptiness, as though the absence itself were whispering. A missing photograph, a false name, a man who had vanished twice. Outside, the sea murmured on, endless and indifferent, carrying away secrets, and sometimes, if one was lucky or cursed, bringing them back again. "Windermere House," said Tuppence, studying the wrought-iron gates that barred the overgrown drive, "sounds far too poetic for a place built on war money." Tommy rattled the latch experimentally. "Poetic or not, it's locked, which suggests we're not exactly expected." They had come by hired car from Kingsport that morning, following Mrs. Mallory's hesitant mention of her late father's estate. The road wound between hedges heavy with sea salt mist, then opened suddenly to a rise overlooking the channel. The house crouched there, half grand, half derelict, an Edwardian sprawl of gables and shuttered windows that stared seaward like blind eyes. A sign on the gate read, "Property of the Mallory Foundation for Veterans." Tuppence raised an eyebrow. "I wonder how many veterans have actually seen the inside of it." "Probably as many as have seen the funds," said Tommy. "Let's hope the caretaker's more welcoming than the decor." He leaned on the bell. After a long pause, footsteps sounded on gravel and the gate swung inward. The man who appeared was lean, stoop-shouldered, and dressed in a dark coat that had known better tailoring. His eyes were a clear, cold grey. "Mr. and Mrs. Beresford?" he asked without surprise. "That's right," said Tommy. "We were hoping to speak to the caretaker, Mr. Venn, I believe." The man inclined his head. "You found him. The house isn't generally open to visitors." "We're not exactly tourists," said Tuppence pleasantly. "We're tracing a few wartime records for a private matter. Mrs. Mallory at the Anchor's Rest suggested you might help." At the mention of his employer's daughter, Venn's expression tightened, but he stood aside. "Very well. The library's where the papers are kept. This way, please." Inside, the air smelled of polish and disuse. Dust motes drifted in slanting light from high windows. The sound of their footsteps seemed almost impertinent. Windermere had once been a house built to impress. Wide staircases, carved balustrades, the kind of quiet wealth that preferred mahogany to marble. But neglect had blurred its pride. A clock ticked solemnly somewhere far off, marking time for no one. "The late Sir Edgar Mallory made his fortune in munitions," Venn said as he led them down a corridor lined with portraits. "After the war, he turned charitable, set up the foundation. Fine words for untidy money." Tuppence's eyes lingered on a portrait of Sir Edgar, a fleshy man with clever eyes and a smile too practised to be kind. "I imagine he liked his secrets neatly catalogued," she murmured. Venn's mouth curved faintly. He liked them profitable. The library occupied the west wing, a handsome room of oak shelves and shuttered windows facing the sea. Files and ledgers were stacked along one wall, tagged foundation accounts. On the desk lay a green lamp, an inkwell gone dry, and a small framed photograph of a younger Mrs. Mallory in nurse's uniform. "Sir Edgar worked here during the war," Venn said. "Kept papers from his government contracts, some correspondence. I've left everything as it was." Tuppence wandered toward the shelves. "Would you mind if we have a look?" "Help yourselves. I'll be in the hall if you need anything." When he was gone, she glanced at Tommy. "He's about as chatty as a tombstone." "And probably twice as informative," Tommy replied. "Let's see what our silent friend's guarding." They began with the obvious. Most of the folders held dull material, shipping invoices, supply contracts, donations to veterans' hospitals. But in a pigeonhole behind the desk, Tuppence found a bundle of telegrams tied with faded ribbon. The paper had browned at the edges, but the message style was unmistakable, military shorthand, riddled with numbers and half-phrases. "Tommy," she whispered, "look at this. Identical cipher to the one in RK's note." He leaned over her shoulder. "Package secure, awaiting exchange, acknowledge from Keeper." "That's him, isn't it? Raven Keeper." "Exactly." Her eyes gleamed, which means Sir Edgar was in direct contact with him. They worked in absorbed silence for a quarter of an hour, piecing fragments together. Each telegram seemed to confirm some covert arrangement, shipments through neutral ports, coded references to double cover. The last message ended abruptly. Delay Winmere transfer. Orders suspended. Tuppence sat back. Whatever this was, it stopped suddenly. No follow-up, no closure. "Or someone made sure the closure wasn't recorded," said Tommy. She moved toward the far wall, running a gloved hand along the panelling. If Sir Edgar had dealings with RK, there may be more here than papers. Her fingers paused on a faint irregularity, one panel slightly misaligned. She pressed. It yielded with a soft click, revealing a shallow recess. Inside lay a revolver wrapped in oilcloth and a photograph half-burned at the edges. She drew it out carefully. The picture showed 4 men standing before what looked like a field tent. One face was unmistakable. Raven Keeper, younger, but recognizably the man from the photograph in Kingsport. Beside him stood Sir Edgar Mallory. And between them, Tuppence caught her breath, was Sir Andrew Linton. Tommy took the photo, whistling softly. So our old friend had closer ties than he admitted. "Perhaps he didn't lie," said Tuppence thoughtfully. "Perhaps he simply omitted." She examined the revolver. It was a standard service issue, but the serial number had been filed off. "You know what's strange?" she said. "It's clean, oiled, maintained. Someone's handled it recently." Before Tommy could answer, the door opened quietly behind them. Mr. Venn stood in the threshold, expression unreadable. "Find what you were looking for?" he asked. Tuppence slipped the revolver back into the recess and closed it with casual grace. "Some interesting correspondence, yes. Your late employer was a man of varied interests." "Sir Edgar had many correspondents," said Venn. "Too many, perhaps." He stepped into the room, his gaze resting briefly on the desk. "You've a sharp eye, Mrs. Beresford. Most visitors overlook those telegrams. Sir Andrew Linton didn't, of course." Tommy's head snapped up. "Linton's been here?" "About 3 weeks ago. Said he was checking records for the Foundation. Spent an hour in this room. Asked about a man named Kent. Roland Kent. I told him there was nothing to find." "And was there?" asked Tuppence softly. Venn's lips twitched in what might have been a smile. "Depends who's asking." There was a silence edged with something harder than politeness. Tuppence broke it first. "Sir Andrew mentioned knowing RK, Raven Keeper. He implied the man died long ago." "Then he misremembered," said Venn. "People in his position often do." He turned toward the door. "You'll forgive me, but I must lock up soon. The Foundation keeps no late hours." Outside, the afternoon had dimmed to a pewter glow. The Beresfords paused at the top of the drive, looking back at the house. From the upper windows, the reflection of the sea flickered like restless light, giving the illusion of movement behind the glass. "Well," said Tommy, "that was either immensely helpful or profoundly misleading." "Both," said Tuppence. "Mr. Venn is not the sort to gossip, which means every word he spoke was deliberate. And notice what he didn't say. He never denied that RK was alive." Tommy nodded slowly. He also made sure we knew Linton had been here, almost as if he wanted suspicion pointed that way. "Precisely," she smiled wryly. "He is an efficient caretaker. He even tends to other people's reputations." They walked down the drive toward the waiting car. The wind off the sea carried the scent of damp leaves and salt, sharp and cleansing. Behind them, Winmere's windows seemed to darken all at once, as though the house were shutting its eyes. Back at the Anchor's Rest, Mrs. Mallory was arranging flowers in the front hall. She looked up as they entered. "Well, did you find my father's ghosts?" "Several," said Tuppence lightly, "including one who keeps a very tidy library." Mrs. Mallory laughed, though uneasily. "Old Venn does fuss over that house. Lives there alone, you know. Hardly ever comes into town. My father trusted him more than anyone. Did he ever mention a man named Roland Kent? Asked Tommy. The woman's face changed slightly. Just a flicker, gone almost at once. I don't think so. Why? Oh, just curiosity, said Tuppence. Kingsport seems full of coincidences. They went upstairs. Once the door was closed, Tuppence pulled the photograph from her handbag. I slipped it out while Venn admired his own evasiveness, she said with satisfaction. Look at them, RK, Linton and Mallory together. Whatever this final exchange was, they were all in it. Tommy poured 2 glasses of brandy. And if Linton was here 3 weeks ago asking about Kent, then either he's protecting someone, or he's the reason the protections failed. Tuppence stared out at the darkening harbour. He told us to be discreet, she murmured. Perhaps he meant don't uncover what I buried myself. The clock downstairs chimed 7. Somewhere outside, a gull cried sharply and fell silent. Tuppence picked up the photograph again, her fingers tracing the burned edge where a 4th figure had been cut away by flame. Someone tried to erase this, she said softly. But history never burns completely. There's always a scrap left behind. Tommy raised his glass. To scraps, then, and to whoever's keeping them alive. They drank, the faint salt of the sea on the air mingling with the bite of the brandy. Beyond the window, Windermere House loomed against the fading horizon, a silhouette vast, secretive and waiting. Promise me, said Tommy as he straightened his tie, that if the evening ends in another corpse, we'll at least finish dessert first. Tuppence laughed softly, adjusting the clasp on her pearl necklace. You do love your priorities, dear, but I suspect this club is more in danger of indigestion than intrigue. Kingsport's local club had the air of a place that had never quite moved on from empire. Dark panelling, portraits of admirals, and a whiff of cigar smoke ground into the curtains. The occasion was a monthly dinner for Friends of the Foundation, a phrase that covered everyone from retired naval officers to the merely curious. A string quartet played in the corner, valiantly against the murmur of voices and the clink of glassware. Tuppence, radiant and composed, made her entrance as though she'd been born to small-town society dinners. Tommy, less graceful but infinitely more alert, scanned the room with a veteran's caution. He noticed 2 men at the bar turn slightly as they entered, not rudely, but with the quiet curiosity of those who already knew more than they should. "Smile," whispered Tuppence. "You look like a man expecting an ambush." "I am," he said, "but I'll do it with charm." They were soon seated near the head of the long table, beside a grey-haired widow in a black silk gown who introduced herself as Mrs. Kershaw. Her laugh was too loud, her perfume faintly of violets. "Such a delight to have new faces," she said. "Kingsport's frightfully dull unless one enjoys gossip about fishing quotas." "I've heard worse conversation," said Tuppence. "At least fish don't lie." "Ah, you'd be surprised." Mrs. Kershaw leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Especially when they're human ones." The first course arrived, cream of lobster soup. Conversation swelled around them, men reminiscing about naval service, women debating whether the Foundation should fund a new memorial plaque. The mood was convivial, but beneath it Tuppence sensed strain, a kind of practiced civility that cracked at the edges. Mrs. Kershaw dabbed her lips with her napkin. "You're from London, aren't you? Everyone's been talking about the pair of you." "Flattering," said Tommy lightly, "though I can't imagine why." "People notice newcomers," she said, smiling, though her hand trembled as she reached for her wineglass. "Especially those who ask questions about the past. It's not always kind, the past." Tuppence gave her an encouraging look. "You sound as though you speak from experience." Mrs. Kershaw hesitated. "My late husband was with the Ministry of Supply during the war. Worked with Sir Edgar Mallory, your landlady's father. Good man, mostly. But he knew things." "About what?" asked Tuppence. "About who betrayed whom?" The widow's eyes flicked nervously to the surrounding tables. "He used to say that what they buried wasn't always what was dead." Tuppence's heart gave a small, involuntary jolt. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Kershaw's fingers twisted her napkin. "He told me once, in one of his darker moods, that the man they buried wasn't RK at all, that it was a substitute, a mistake, he called it, a necessary one." Before Tuppence could press further, a toast was called at the head of the table. Chairs scraped, glasses lifted. The host, An elderly colonel with a moustache that might have been issued by the War Office rose and declared, "To absent friends, and the men who gave their best years that others might live in peace." The room chorused, "To absent friends!" The crystal rang, bright and brittle. Tuppence's gaze flicked toward Mrs. Kershaw, who was staring into her wine as if seeing ghosts. Meanwhile, Tommy had caught another kind of conversation. Two men stood near the fireplace, speaking in voices pitched just low enough to seem private, which of course only sharpened his hearing. "London pair," murmured one, "asking questions about Mallory, Linton, the old files. Ven says they were snooping in the library." "Dangerous game," said the other. "Best they take the hint before someone gives them the other kind." Tommy's fingers tightened around his glass. He shifted slightly, pretending to admire the ship models in the display case. The men moved on, but their words stayed behind like smoke. When he returned to the table, Tuppence was stirring her coffee with an expression of mild distraction, the look she wore when something truly startling had just occurred. "What did she tell you?" he murmured. "That her husband knew the body they buried wasn't Ravenkeeper," she whispered. "That someone else was buried in his place." Tommy blinked. "That's not just gossip, that's rewriting history." "Exactly. And if it's true, then our dead man might not be as dead as anyone believes." They both smiled automatically as the dessert arrived, two conspirators hiding dynamite beneath the tablecloth. After dinner came the predictable round of speeches, the raffle for charity, and the polite laughter of people pretending they hadn't heard the same jokes last month. When it was over, the Beresfords made their way out into the cool night. The air smelled of seaweed and smoke from the chimneys. Along the promenade, lamps cast long, uneven reflections on the cobblestones. Tuppence slipped her arm through Tommy's. Our hostess looked positively relieved to see us go. "She's probably regretting every word she said," Tommy replied. "If her husband really did know something, it might explain why she's half frightened and half drunk." "Or half truthful," Tuppence added. "I can never resist the middle ground." They turned the corner toward the inn. The Anchor's Rest was quiet, a triangle of yellow light spilling from the sitting-room window. Inside, Mrs. Mallory had left a tray with tea and biscuits on the hall table. All seemed calm, domestic, until Tommy opened the door to their room. Then calm collapsed. The drawers were half open, clothes displaced, papers scattered. The bedspread bore the marks of rough hands. The wardrobe door hung ajar. Tuppence's voice was very quiet. "Well, someone's been tidying up after us." Tommy crossed quickly to the dresser, pulled open the drawer where they had hidden the revolver from Windermere. It was empty. He exhaled through his teeth. Gone. She picked up the overturned pillow and smoothed it absently. They knew exactly what they were looking for. "Which means Ven or someone close to him tipped them off." Tommy's tone was grim. "You don't ransack a guest room on a hunch." Tuppence studied the mess. Nothing else appeared missing. Not their money, not her jewellery, not even the photograph she'd hidden inside a book. Only the gun. "They wanted to remove the one thing that could tie Windermere to violence," she said. "The question is, why now?" Tommy crouched, inspecting the floor. A fine smear of mud led from the balcony door, faint but clear under the lamplight. "Because they knew we'd found the telegrams," he said, "and they don't want us connecting the dots." Tuppence looked toward the window. The curtains shifted faintly, not from wind, but from the receding shape of someone stepping away into the darkness below. Tommy reached the balcony in time to see the alley beyond, empty except for a cat darting into shadow. He shut the door and drew the curtain. "Someone's been watching us since Windermere," he said. "This isn't curiosity anymore, it's surveillance." Tuppence met his eyes. "Then we're getting close. People only spy when they're afraid." "Or when they're paid," said Tommy dryly. "But I take your point." She sat on the edge of the bed, folding her hands. "Tommy, what if Mrs. Kershaw's right? What if they buried the wrong man? Suppose the real RK disappeared, and whoever died in his place was meant to keep the secret buried?" "That would explain the missing revolver," he said. "A weapon that killed the substitute, cleaned up after and hidden at Windermere." She nodded slowly. "And now it's vanished again. Convenient, isn't it?" He sighed. "You realize we're dealing with people who tie up loose ends rather efficiently." Tuppence's smile was faint but determined. "Then let's make sure we're not loose ends." Later, when the lights were out, Tommy lay awake listening. The inn was still, too still. Somewhere down the hall a floorboard creaked, followed by the faint click of a closing door. He rose, crossed to the window, and peered through the narrow gap in the curtains. Across the street a car sat under the lamplight, engine off but unmistakably occupied. The faint glow of a cigarette flared inside, then died. He could just make out two silhouettes, one tall, one smaller, waiting. He returned to the bed. "We've acquired another audience," he murmured. Tuppence's eyes opened immediately. "How many?" "Two in a car opposite, patient sort of watchers." She reached for his hand. "Good. Let them watch. The longer they wait, the more mistakes they'll make." He smiled in the dark. "That's my girl." For a long moment they were silent, listening to the steady hum of the sea. Then Tuppence spoke again, softly but with the steel of certainty. "Tommy, I think R.K., Ravenkeeper, was never a traitor at all. I think he was the scapegoat, and someone's been guarding that lie for 20 years. Tommy squeezed her hand. "And we're the ones digging it up." "Exactly," she whispered, "which means we'd better start digging faster." Outside, the cigarette flared again, watching, waiting, and upstairs in the quiet inn, the two who refused to be buried lay awake, thinking of ghosts and the living men who had made them. "Good heavens," said Tommy, looking up from his breakfast paper. "If ghosts are punctual, I'd say ours has just arrived by the 9:15. Tuppence followed his gaze to the inn's window. A sleek black motor car had drawn up outside the Anchor's Rest, its polished bonnet already speckled with salt spray from the sea breeze. The man stepping out was unmistakable, tall, angular, and carrying an aura of command that had once been second nature to him. Sir Andrew Linton. He looked older than he had 3 days before in London. The brisk confidence that usually clung to him like his aftershave was gone, replaced by a pallor that had nothing to do with travel. He paid the driver, then stood for a moment on the cobblestones, surveying the quiet harbour as if trying to measure how far he'd fallen since his days of issuing orders that shaped wars. Tuppence was already on her feet. "Well, that answers one question." "Yes," said Tommy dryly. "The one about whether the past travels first class." Sir Andrew was shown into the lounge, where the Beresfords waited beside the cold fireplace. The morning light from the bay caught the lines of strain around his mouth. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. "You found Winmere," he said flatly, "and Ven let you in." Tommy nodded. He was almost too accommodating. Linton's expression darkened. "That fool's been sniffing around the ashes for years. He doesn't understand that some files were burned for good reason." Tuppence met his gaze evenly. "A revolver and a photograph of you standing beside Ravenkeeper don't look like ashes to me." For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, with a visible effort, he sank into the nearest armchair and pulled off his gloves. His hands trembled slightly. "You think I lied to you?" he said at last. Tuppence smiled faintly. "We think you told us the truth, just not the whole of it." Linton's eyes flickered toward the window, where sunlight broke over the harbour in trembling gold. "You must understand, the service had to work in shadows. When Ravenkeeper," he hesitated over the name as though it still carried danger, "was first suspected, he was following orders. We instructed him to feign betrayal. His mission was to feed false intelligence to Berlin and expose the chain of moles within our own command. But something went wrong. The contact he was meant to deceive vanished. His own name was sent back across the channel, listed as a traitor." "So the deception became his tombstone," said Tommy quietly. "Exactly. We needed the story to hold. Morale was brittle and truth was a luxury." He rubbed his temples. "I burned the original files myself. The man had a family. If they knew, they'd have been hounded to ruin. Better for the world to think him dead and disgraced." Tuppence studied him carefully. "You said the man, not Ravenkeeper. So who was he really?" Linton's jaw tightened. "I can't tell you. Not now." "Because he's alive?" she pressed. Linton didn't answer. His silence was answer enough. Tommy leaned forward. "Sir Andrew, if he survived, why the charade after all these years? Why hide from his own country?" Linton's voice dropped. "Because he learned something that wasn't meant to be learned. There were other players. The line between hero and profiteer was blurred in those final months. Men made fortunes on secrets. Some of them still live on those profits." He stood abruptly. "I shouldn't have come, But you've stirred up attention more than you know. You're being watched." "Yes," said Tuppence calmly. "We'd rather noticed." His mouth twisted into something like admiration. "Then you'll understand this warning. Stop now. There are names that can't afford to resurface, and—" he hesitated, lowering his voice. "His son walks among you now." Tuppence's heart gave a small, startled leap. "You mean Raven Keeper's son?" Linton nodded once. "He doesn't know the truth. He believes the old story. Leave it that way." Tommy frowned. "And if we don't?" "Then you'll end up like me," he said quietly. "Haunted, hunted, and one step too late." He turned toward the door before either could stop him. "If you're wise, you'll leave Kingsport by nightfall." They didn't. By afternoon, the inn was quieter than usual. Mrs. Mallory claimed she was visiting a friend in the next village. Ven was nowhere to be seen. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. Tommy and Tuppence spent the day walking the cliffs, discussing Linton's confession in careful fragments. Every word raised more questions. "If R.K. was never a traitor," said Tuppence, "then who framed him?" Tommy scowled. "Sir Edgar Mallory's name keeps circling back. And now Linton's warning about the son. What if he meant Colin Kent, the young man we've not yet met but keep hearing whispers about?" "The son of R.K., she mused. "Raven Keeper, Roland Kent. It fits." Tommy kicked at a pebble. "So our dead spy isn't dead. His son's alive, and our only witness tells us the truth one sentence at a time." "Typical government efficiency," she said dryly. "But if Linton was right about being watched, we may not get another chance to ask him more." He gave her a sideways glance. "I've a feeling we won't need to." They returned to Kingsport at dusk. The harbour lamps had just flickered to life, their reflections trembling on the dark water. From the quay came the faint ring of metal on wood and the muffled voices of dock workers unloading cargo. A constable passed them, saluting absently, and Tuppence caught the smell of the sea, sharp, briny, and somehow expectant. "Strange," said Tommy. "You'd think an evening like this would feel peaceful." "It does," she said, "just not in the right way." As they turned toward the inn, a commotion erupted near the pier. A shout, a splash, the hurried cry of "Man overboard!" By the time they reached the edge of the quay, a small crowd had gathered. 2 fishermen were hauling something dark and heavy from the water. Tuppence pressed forward, dread already forming before her eyes confirmed it. The drowned man's face, pale beneath the lamplight, was unmistakable. Sir Andrew Linton. His head lolled against his shoulder, water dripping from silver hair. The constable bent over him, muttering, "Slipped, most like, poor devil." Tommy's voice was low. "No, look at his wrists." Tuppence knelt, ignoring the chill seeping through her coat. The bruises were clear, dark rings, deep and symmetrical, marks not from a fall, but from restraint. "Someone held him," she whispered, then pushed him. A hush spread as the crowd realized who the dead man was. Names passed in murmurs. Sir Andrew, London, intelligence. Tommy stood, his expression hardening. "Well," he said grimly, "that answers whether he was right about being hunted." The body was taken to the local infirmary, and statements collected with perfunctory efficiency. By the time the Beresfords returned to the Anchor's Rest, the night had grown thick and windless. Mrs. Mallory met them in the hallway, her face pale beneath her careful smile. "Such dreadful news," she murmured. "They say Sir Andrew slipped while boarding one of the boats." Tuppence looked her straight in the eye. "And what do you say?" The woman hesitated. "Accidents happen, Mrs. Beresford, especially to men who ask too many questions." Then she turned away, her keys jingling softly, a sound that seemed suddenly sinister. Tommy closed the lounge door behind them and poured 2 stiff drinks. "There's our warning, Tuppence, delivered neatly and with local hospitality." But she didn't take her glass. She stood by the mantel, staring into the unlit fireplace. "He came all this way to confess, Tommy, and before he could finish, he's dead." "He finished enough," said Tommy. "He told us what RK really was, and he told us about the son." She turned sharply. "Which means whoever killed him didn't want that son to learn the truth." He nodded. "So our next step is finding the boy before they do." Tuppence smiled faintly, though her eyes were fierce. "You know, if someone's rewriting history, I'd rather edit it myself." He raised his glass. "To editors, then." "And to double agents who refuse to stay dead," she added. They drank, and for a moment the familiar warmth of partnership steadied them both, but the night refused to rest easy. Hours later, Tommy sat at the writing desk, sketching a rough map of connections, names, places, arrows linking Windermere to Kingsport, Linton to Mallory, RK to Roland Kent. The pattern that emerged was messy, but one truth pulsed beneath it. Everything circled back to Windermere House. He heard soft footsteps behind him. Tuppence, still in her robe, came to stand beside the desk. Her hair, unpinned, caught the lamplight in gold strands. "You can't sleep either," she said quietly. "No, I keep seeing his face in the water." He looked almost relieved. "Perhaps he thought it was over," she said. "He was wrong." Tommy looked up at her. "If we go on, Tuppence." She smiled, the familiar, fearless glint returning. "If we go on, we do what we've always done. We see it through." The clock struck midnight, its chime rolling through the silence like a warning. Outside, the tide began to turn, drawing back from the pier as if erasing the night's violence. But on the desk, the map of names remained, a web of deceit that no tide could wash clean. And at its centre, like the heart of some forgotten riddle, waited the name that had started it all, RK. "You're frowning at that note again," said Tommy, setting down his cup of tea. "It's starting to look nervous." Tuppence didn't look up. The coded message lay spread before her on the desk in their room at the Anchor's Rest, the faded ink faintly glimmering under lamplight. Numbers and letters sprawled across the page like a stubborn crossword that refused to yield. Around her were scraps of paper, scribbled formulas, and a battered copy of a wartime cipher manual she had borrowed, without asking, from the local library. "Do hush, Tommy," she murmured, pencil poised between her teeth. "I'm on the verge of enlightenment." "That's what you said 3 cups of tea ago." "Yes, but now I mean it." Her voice carried that unmistakable note of triumph he had learned to fear slightly. "Look, these numbers repeat in sequences of 12, and if you translate the letters by offset, they form words, or rather, locations." Tommy leaned over her shoulder. "I see a 12 and I see a headache." Tuppence's eyes gleamed. "No, darling, look properly. WINDMEREVAULT 12. Vault 12. It's a place." Tommy whistled. "Vault 12? Sounds like something out of a spy film." "Or a mausoleum," she said cheerfully. "Either way, we're going." He groaned. "Can't we wait until daylight?" She shook her head. "I don't want to give Mr. Venn time to tidy up again." The night was still and sharp as glass. The moon hung low above the channel, throwing the sea into molten silver and stretching Windermere House's shadow long across the cliffs. They parked the car half a mile down the lane and continued on foot, keeping to the hedgerows. Tommy, with a torch and a sardonic running commentary, followed Tuppence's quick, sure pace. "You do realise," he muttered, "that breaking into houses has become your new hobby." "I prefer to call it research." The gate stood locked, but the side path they had noticed earlier remained open, leading to the servants' entrance. Windermere loomed ahead, its windows blank and dark. The Beresfords moved silently through the kitchen garden, past the overgrown hedges and into the rear hall, where Tuppence's small torch painted narrow tunnels of light on the walls. The library door was unlocked. "Convenient," said Tommy softly. "Too convenient," murmured Tuppence. "That always worries me." Inside, the air was colder than before, and the faint scent of oil and dust clung to the wood. The green-shaded lamp stood exactly where it had been left, the desk untouched. Yet the silence had a different texture tonight, tense, watchful, expectant. She crossed to the wall panel where she had discovered the hidden recess. The revolver was gone, of course, but behind it, she ran her fingers along the wood again and frowned. "There's a gap, deeper than I thought." With a deft motion, she pressed the edge. A soft click. Then the panel slid aside, revealing a narrow stone passage beyond. "Tommy," she whispered. "Vault 12. He sighed. "I was afraid you'd say that." They stepped inside, pulling the panel closed behind them. The air was damp and close, carrying the smell of old paper and metal. The passage sloped downward, its walls reinforced by ancient brick. Tuppence's torch beam danced ahead, illuminating pipes, cobwebs, and the occasional scurrying shadow. At the end of the corridor, A rusted door waited, its lock corroded but intact. A faded stencil above it read Vault 12. Tommy knelt to inspect it. "Simple bolt system. Give me a moment." "You're rather practiced at this," she observed. "I learned from necessity," he replied, producing a small knife. "You married me knowing I'm versatile." The lock gave way with a reluctant groan. The door opened inward, and the smell that greeted them was unmistakable. Dust, ink, and the faint sweetness of decay. Inside lay a room no larger than a chapel vestry, rows of filing cabinets, shelves of rolled maps, and crates labelled Archives. Confidential, 1944. On the far wall stood a desk with an oil lamp beside it, as though someone had once used this place as an office beneath the earth. Tuppence moved forward reverently. So this is where he hid the truth. They opened the nearest cabinet. Files upon files, neatly bound and labelled with codes. Operation Double Back, Deception Chain North, Internal Reports, Linton, Mallory. Many had been sealed with wax that had long since cracked. Tommy leafed through one folder, frowning. "These are duplicate communications. Decoys, false reports. Look at this. Deliver misinformation to Berlin through intermediary RK. It's exactly what Linton described." Tuppence found a smaller box wrapped in oilskin. Inside lay black and white photographs. Agents in field uniforms, faces half-lit, some marked with crosses. One was Ravenkeeper himself, his eyes direct and unsettling even through decades of dust. And beneath the photographs, a small leather-bound diary. She drew it out carefully. The first page bore the initials RK, written in the same bold hand as the coded letter. "Listen," she whispered, reading aloud. "Operation Double Back commences. My orders are clear, to play Judas for a greater good. God forgive me if I am betrayed before I betray." Tommy exhaled slowly. So it was all true. He was the bait. She turned the pages, daily entries, brief and methodical at first, then growing hurried, scattered. "Linton promises protection for my family. Mallory insists money must be moved to Switzerland. Something is wrong, they know too much. Venn delivered new orders, but I no longer trust him. Tomorrow I meet at Winmere for final exchange." The sentence stopped mid-line, the ink trailing off into a violent streak. Tuppence closed the book slowly. He never finished the sentence. Someone found him before he could. Tommy's jaw tightened. "And Venn's name is right there in black and white." "Yes," she said softly, "acting as courier, perhaps more." They were still absorbing the discovery when a faint scrape echoed from the corridor. A footstep, then the creak of hinges. The beam of another light flickered against the far wall. "Someone's coming," whispered Tuppence. Tommy doused their torch, plunging them into darkness. They held their breath as the sound drew nearer, slow, deliberate, accompanied by the soft hiss of a lantern. A shadow lengthened across the floor. Then a familiar voice, low and sharp, cut the silence. "I thought I might find you here." Mr. Venn stood in the doorway, the lantern's light throwing sharp angles across his face. His expression was unreadable, but his tone carried quiet accusation. "You've trespassed into property belonging to the Mallory Foundation," he said, "and now you're stealing what doesn't belong to you." Tuppence straightened, her own composure unshaken. "I'd call it recovering what your employer buried, unless, of course, you prefer the word cover-up." He stepped closer. "You have no idea what these papers mean." "Oh, I think we're beginning to," said Tommy, "especially the ones with your name in them." Venn's jaw tightened. Those were different times. Orders came from above. "Sir Edgar Mallory?" asked Tuppence. He hesitated, then looked past them toward the diary in her hand. "Put that down." "I don't take instructions from grave robbers," she said crisply. For the first time, emotion cracked through his mask. Not anger, but weariness. "You don't understand. Those men, Mallory, Linton, Kent, they played a game that swallowed lives. I was just a messenger. I delivered orders, closed files, burned what I was told to burn." "Except this room," said Tommy quietly. Venn met his gaze. "I couldn't. Some part of me hoped the truth might be worth keeping, but now it's only dangerous." "Dangerous to whom?" asked Tuppence. Before he could answer, a sound shattered the tension, a gunshot sharp and echoing through the tunnels above. Dust sifted from the ceiling. Tommy's instincts snapped taut. That came from the main hall. Ven turned toward the door, lantern swinging wildly. "Stay here." "Not likely," said Tuppence, already moving. They hurried after him, the corridor twisting like a serpent. The second door opened into the cellar, where faint moonlight filtered through the slats of a half-boarded window. Somewhere above, footsteps pounded across the floorboards, followed by another muffled thud. Ven reached the stairs first. "If you value your lives, you'll leave now," he snapped over his shoulder. "After you tell us who's shooting at whom," said Tommy. But Ven didn't answer. He vanished up the stairwell, lantern light bobbing and fading as he went. Moments later, the sound of a door slamming echoed through the house. Tuppence caught her breath, clutching the diary. "He's running." "Then we follow," said Tommy, "before someone else decides we're next." They emerged into the library, where a faint smell of cordite lingered. One of the window panes was shattered. Cold night air poured through. A chair lay overturned, and on the rug, a single spent cartridge gleamed under the lamplight. Tuppence knelt beside it. "38 caliber," she said softly. "The same type as the revolver from this house." "The revolver that's now missing," said Tommy grimly. Outside, an engine roared to life. They raced to the window in time to see the dim outline of a car tearing away down the drive, its headlights extinguished, swallowed by darkness. Tuppence pressed her palm against the glass. "So much for answers." Tommy looked at her, his face set in lines of grim determination. "No, he's not escaping, not this time. He's leading us to whoever fired that shot." She opened the diary again, her thumb resting on the final page, the broken sentence that ended in silence. "Tomorrow I meet at Winmere for final exchange." She closed it gently. "Tomorrow, then. We finish what he started." Outside, the sea whispered against the cliffs, carrying the scent of salt and old secrets. In the distance, the faint gleam of headlights disappeared over the rise, a vanishing trail into the past. But in the vault beneath Winmere, the lamp still burned on the desk, illuminating a single page left behind, a list of names under the heading Operation Double Back. One name had been crossed out in thick, angry ink, Sir Andrew Linton, and beneath it, untouched, waiting its turn, Mr. Venn. The figure in the doorway stood tense and wary, outlined by the lantern light that still swung from the tunnel behind. He was young, mid-30s perhaps, with dark hair damp from the mist and a face caught somewhere between anger and bewilderment. "Don't move," he said sharply. "Who are you, and what are you doing here?" Tommy raised his hands in mock surrender. "You first, old chap. We have a distressing habit of being interrupted by armed strangers in country houses." The man blinked, lowering the small revolver he held. His voice softened but didn't steady. "My name's Colin Kent. I came because I was told something was hidden here, something to do with my father." Tuppence exchanged a quick glance with Tommy. "Your father?" she said carefully. "Would that be Roland Kent?" The young man's eyes widened. "You knew him?" "In a manner of speaking," she replied, drawing the small leather diary from her coat. "We've been reading his handwriting." He stared at the book as though it were a ghost. "That can't be. He burned everything before they came for him." Tommy said quietly, "Your father didn't betray anyone, Mr. Kent. He was a double agent. The records prove it." But Colin shook his head fiercely. "No, he was a traitor. It's what they told us. My mother, my school, everyone. He died in disgrace. I was 12 when they buried him." "They buried someone," Tuppence said. "But whether it was your father is another matter." The silence that followed seemed to press against the walls. Colin stared down at the diary as she opened it to the last page. "Listen," said Tuppence gently. "Your father's final entry. It was not I who traded the list to—" She turned the page. The sentence broke off in a jagged line. He never finished. Something stopped him. Colin took the book, his fingers tracing the half-written words. "He used to tell me stories," he said slowly. "Always about loyalty. How truth wears many uniforms. I thought it was just something he said to make peace with his guilt." "Or his burden," murmured Tuppence. He looked up at her. "Who are you really? Reporters? Historians?" Tommy smiled faintly. "Former adventurers who never learned the art of leaving mysteries alone." That earned a small, involuntary laugh, the kind that breaks grief's rhythm for an instant. But before the sound could fade, The heavy click of a bolt echoed behind them. They turned. Mr. Venn stood in the archway, the lantern still in his hand. His face was a mask of calm. His other hand rested on the wall lever beside the door. "I warned you," he said. "You should have left while you had the chance." The door swung shut with a grinding of metal, and a second later they heard the sharp clang of the locking bar fall into place. Tommy tried the handle. It didn't budge. "Well," he said dryly, "that settles who's footing the villain's bill." Venn regarded them from the other side of the bars. "You think this is villainy? It's housekeeping. My orders haven't changed since 1945, to keep Windermere clean of loose ends." "Who's giving the orders now?" Tuppence demanded. He hesitated. "That doesn't matter. What matters is that certain truths were never meant to surface. Too many lives and fortunes were built on silence." "You were intelligence," Tommy said suddenly, "not just a caretaker." Venn's smile was thin. "I was what they called a cleaner. My job was to remove evidence, people, papers, memories. When the war ended, they thought the game was over. But it never ends, does it?" Colin stepped forward, his voice shaking with fury. "You worked for my father." "I delivered his orders," Venn said. "And then I was told to erase him. He wasn't supposed to live long enough to write that diary." Tuppence drew herself up. "So you killed him?" The old man's eyes flickered. "No, I didn't have to. The others did it for me, the ones who wanted Mallory's ledgers destroyed and Linton's conscience quieted. I just swept the ashes." He set the lantern down outside the bars, its light pooling on the stone. "You'll stay here until morning. Then I'll finish what should have been finished years ago." Tommy's voice was mild, but his eyes were cold. "You mean burn the place? And us with it?" Venn didn't answer. He turned the key, pocketed it, and walked away down the tunnel. For a moment, the only sound was the steady drip of water from the ceiling. Then Tuppence took a deep breath. "I do wish people would stop locking us in cellars. It's becoming a motif." Tommy managed a grim chuckle. "You're remarkably calm for a woman about to be incinerated." "I'm choosing optimism. He said morning. That gives us a few hours." Colin had sunk onto a crate, his head in his hands. "This is my fault. If I hadn't come—" "Nonsense," said Tuppence briskly. "You're the reason we're closer to the truth than ever. Now help us find a way out before optimism turns to smoke." They searched the vault quickly. The door was solid steel, the hinges external. No other exit, only the narrow air vent near the ceiling and the shelves of files lining the walls. Tommy examined the bolt mechanism through the bars. "Old design," he murmured. "If I can jam the locking rod, it might slip." Tuppence handed him a metal file from one of the crates. "You realize that's a dreadful pun." "I'm under pressure." Minutes stretched into an hour. The air grew thicker, the lantern flame wavered. At last came a satisfying metallic clank and the slow, reluctant groan of the bolt sliding free. Tommy grinned. "And that, my dear, is why you always travel with an ex-major." They pushed the door open cautiously. The passage beyond was empty. Somewhere above, the house creaked, the familiar sigh of old wood, or perhaps something heavier. They followed the sound of footsteps up the stone stairs, moving silently past the cellar arch into the main corridor. The air smelled faintly of kerosene. "Dear heaven," whispered Tuppence, "he's going to torch it." They entered the library. The desk lamp burned low, casting a golden pool across the papers. On the mantel, a can of paraffin stood half open, its scent sharp in the air. But Venn was gone. Tommy crossed to the window and peered out. "Car tracks. Fresh. He's gone to fetch something, or someone." Colin's face was pale. "He said he was paid to do this. Paid by who?" Tuppence answered softly. "The same person who killed Sir Andrew Linton. The one who needs every witness erased." She opened the diary again, flipping to the unfinished line. "It was not I who traded the list," her eyes narrowed. "The list. He meant the names of double agents. If we can find it, we'll have the proof." Tommy looked around. If he meant to burn everything, where would he keep the most dangerous thing? "In the safest place of all," she said, "the one no one else would touch." Her gaze fell on a large trunk marked to be destroyed. She knelt, forced the clasp, and lifted the lid. Inside lay a small metal case, its lock broken. Within, a sheaf of thin papers, brittle with age. Across the top, Operation Double Back, Personnel Index. Colin stared at the list of names. Near the bottom, one entry made his voice catch. R. Kent. Operative status, loyal. It says loyal. It's here, in black and white. Tuppence smiled gently. Your father's honour was never lost, only buried. He swallowed hard, tears stinging his eyes. Then why didn't they show this to my mother? Why let her die believing? Because truth, she said softly, wears many uniforms. The sound of an engine drifted through the broken window, followed by the crunch of gravel. Headlights swept briefly across the drive. Tommy straightened. He's back. Tuppence stuffed the papers into her coat. Then we leave through the kitchen door before this becomes a bonfire. They moved swiftly, but the front door slammed open before they reached the passage. Ven's silhouette filled the doorway, lantern in hand, a revolver gleaming at his side. I told you to stay put, he said. Now there's no point in delaying. You're making a mistake, said Tommy evenly. That list exonerates Kent. If your employer learns, you let it survive. Exactly, Ven interrupted, which is why no one will learn anything. He raised the revolver. But before he could fire, Colin stepped forward. Mr. Ven, wait. You served my father once. If there's any honour left in you, don't make his murder complete. Something flickered across the old man's face, a tremor of recognition, of ghosts stirred from the long sleep of obedience. He believed in you, Colin went on, his voice steadier now. He wrote about loyalty, about truth. You kept his diary instead of burning it. Why? Because part of you couldn't destroy him. For an endless second, only the ticking of the old clock filled the room. Then Ven's arm dropped, the gun sagging at his side. You sound like him, he whispered. Tommy moved swiftly, knocking the revolver away before the decision could reverse itself. It skidded across the floor, clattering harmlessly into a corner. Ven didn't resist. He looked suddenly very old, very tired. It doesn't matter, he murmured. They'll send another. Tuppence met his gaze. Then we'll be ready. They left him there, seated by the cold hearth, staring into his lantern's glow as if watching the past dissolve. Outside, dawn was breaking, thin grey light spreading over the cliffs, turning the sea to pewter. Colin stood beside the car, the diary clutched against his chest. She'll finally know, he said softly. My mother. She'll know he wasn't a traitor. Tuppence smiled, though her eyes were shadowed. Sometimes history hides its heroes to protect them. Your father was one of those. Tommy started the engine. And now it's our turn to decide who the villains are. As the car wound down the lane, the first rays of sunlight touched the upper windows of Windermere House. Behind them, the faint column of smoke from Ven's lantern rose into the pale sky, a last salute, or perhaps a signal that the past had finally burned itself out.